Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to class. And I'm again looking forward to having this dialogue, if you will, with all of you. I just wanted to give you your reading assignment over the weekend, and that would be the last two short stories of Flannery O'Connor. And one of them, the first one would be Good Country People. And then the last story that we'll be reading together will be Revelation. And that's actually the very last story she wrote. She was basically on her deathbed, and she hadn't quite finished it, but editors found a couple of completions that she had devised. And so the version that we have is one of those final sort of versions that she had left for the editor that finally put the last together. So anyway, so please read over the weekend. They're both fairly short, Good Country People and Revelation. I also wanted to thank you very much for sending in your responses to the 4 questions that I asked regarding the displaced person. And I will be looking forward to reading them very much so. And then I will get back to you on individual responses. So thank you very much for doing that. That's great. So one of the most interesting questions, I think, that regarding that particular story is who is the displaced person in the story? And then when you think about it, in some ways, all of the characters are displaced. For example, Mr. Guzak and his wife and the 2 children are obviously displaced from their homeland in Poland. Mrs. McIntyre never really feels that she, even though she boasts so oftentimes, she really feels that she's still dependent upon her dead husband, the judge, who's buried in the back field in a grave back there, and she's still feeling not established on her own. Both Mrs. Shortley and Mr. Shortley are both displaced, and as we've discovered halfway through the story, they're off and they have no place really at all. The same thing could be said with Astor and Sulk, the 2 African American characters who are always under threat, especially from Mrs. Shortley, regarding their home and regarding any kind of stability in their life. And you can only imagine during this period when O'Connor was writing what it might have been like for the African Americans in this country. The last character, Father Flynn, is in some ways displaced from his homeland. And during at that time, so many of the Irish priests came to this country as missionaries, and yet there was always that hankering to be back home again in Ireland, where they came from. So to some extent, all of the characters are displaced. And one wonders, was Flannery O'Connor making a comment about the human condition, that the earth, our earthly life, is really not our home, that we're somehow sort of displaced, and the task perhaps of every human being is to try to find a home in this displaced condition. So what we had before us this morning are the 2 stories. We'll probably just get to Greenleaf. I'm not sure if we'll have time to get to everything that rises must converge. But I just wanted to remind you once again of that notion that Flannery O'Connor somehow employs, and that is the anagogical vision. And if you remember, I had mentioned to you that the anagogical vision the anagogue comes from the Greek word meaning climb, or to ascent upward, above. And writing with an anagogical vision is a method that a writer has for a spiritual and moral interpretation of a text. Now, not every writer, obviously, uses that anagogical vision, but certainly Flannery O'Connor is noted for it. In other words, it's a technique that a good writer uses to interpret words, statements, images, things, or events that suggest something beyond the literal meaning. And so that's really important to keep that in mind. But what I wanted to do, just by way of, I wish you were in front of me so we could dialogue more authentically. But I was thinking about, for a student or for anyone reading one of the Flannery O'Connor stories, just to give you an example, looking at Greenleaf. Now, really, there's, let's say, for example, the story is about this woman who runs this small, somewhat rundown dairy farm. And at the end of the story, she gets gored by the bull and she dies. So let's say 2 days later, the local Georgia newspaper reported this event. And this is how it would probably go. The headlines: local woman gored to death by bull. And this is probably how the story might be read. Local dairy farm owner, Mrs. Caroline May, age 56, was found dead by foreman Mr. Charles Greenleaf on April the 15th at 11:15 a.m. The cause of death was the severing of the lower heart valve by the horn of the farm bull. Mrs. May is survived by her two sons, Mr. Schofield May, 36, who was employed at Dupey's Insurance Agency, and Mr. Wesley May, 34, employed at the Georgia State Community College. There will be no service held at the request of the family. Donations can be made to Mr. Schofield for a headstone to be laid in the field where the body was found. Now, in some ways, as silly as that might sound, that kind of sums up the story. There's not much more to it. So my question to you is, what has Flannery O'Connor done to raise this story above this newspaper account about a woman who runs a dairy? She has two sons. She gets killed at the end by the bull. It's obviously an accident, and that's the end of it. That's the story. So what has O'Connor done to raise this story to another level? What has she changed in the account by her use of the anagogical vision? And from what point of view is the story told? So that's sort of the question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think this is fairly true in all of her stories, that the stories are fairly simple, they're pretty straightforward, and yet she uses imagery and color and names and events and titles to raise the story above just a newspaper account. So let's, if we could, let's take a look at this Greenleaf story. First of all, the characters. Mrs. May, she has two sons, Schofield and Wesley. One is an insurance man. The other is a teacher at a junior college someplace local. Then there's Mr. Greenleaf. There's Mrs. Greenleaf, his wife, and they have two sons, O.T. and E.T., and they're twins, and they each have 3 children. They also have 5 daughters. So what might we say about that? Well, first of all, the name Greenleaf is indicative that there is something that is alive it's growing. When you see a dead plant, the plant is turned brown or it's withered. But the title "Green Leaf" again is suggesting something that is alive. The very fact that the green leaves have 7 children, if you remember biblically, and Flannery O'Connor borrows heavily from the scripture and from mythology. And so the number 7 is really an important number. It suggests completion, fulfillment, accomplishment. That's what that number 7 represents. It's known sometimes as the perfect number. And so she's using these titles, such as Greenleaf, the fact that they have 7 children, and the fact that they're totally effective in so many ways. The very fact, now not that, I mean, materialistically this is important, but the very fact that the sons married 2 women from Paris, and now their children are bilingual, and the fact that they both served faithfully in the service of their country, and as a result of that, they were able to purchase a home of their own with the help of the government. So everything is on the up and up with the Greenleafs. But what you have to keep in mind is that the story is being told from a limited, omniscient point of view by Mrs. May. Now, what Mrs. May is telling us, do we believe her? And somehow, as we listen to her talking, is she really telling us exactly the way things are? Or are we seeing it through her own, as we read, her own poor vision? She is a woman with poor vision. Somewhere it's stating that. Now, again, looking at her name, the name May, when you think about the month of May, which is coming up, it's the season, it's the new season of new growth and life. It's the opening of the summer. There's something positive about the month of May, and how ironic her life, her relationship with her sons, is all in some ways sort of down-falling. There's nothing very positive or very uplifting or hopeful about that. So there's a note of irony in that. One of the things I wanted you to notice is also at the very start of the very opening lines of the story, is that this is generally how it opens the first sentence. Mrs. May's bedroom was low and faced on the east, and the bull, silvered in the moonlight, stood under it, his head raised, like some patient god come down to woo her. Now, what's important to remember, and I hope all of you are able to continue reading O'Connor, because I think the more you read her, the more you begin to see how she's using the language, and how she's using imagery and metaphor in such a positive way. Immediately, characters that we don't oftentimes think of in the story is the bull. In many ways, the bull is the principal character in the story. And as you may know, the bull is a very powerful symbol in so many cultures, such as the Mesopotamian, the Egyptians, the Iranians, South Asia, Greece, the Roman Empire, even in Irish mythology. The bull plays a prominent role representing society and representing religions. In the Roman Empire, from the 2nd to the 4th centuries, there was the common practice of sacrificing the bull for the well-being of the people and the state. And O'Connor, being the Catholic that she was, a very strong, committed Catholic, you could almost begin to see the image of Christ in the bull. When he comes to the edge of her house in the middle of the night, the darkness of the night, all that was shining was the moon. The bull had a crown of what appears to be a crown of thorns on his head. So you could almost assume, if you are with O'Connor in her stories, that the bull is a kind of a Christ figure that's come to woo her, and then we would ask ourselves, well, why is Christ wooing this, in some ways, this rather nasty person who seems to be rather bitter and angry? She's clearly a racist, and she's in many ways really insufferable. And what is the bull? And how? So if you look, as we read through the entire story, the bull plays a very prominent role all the way through. And what is Mrs. May's relationship to this, let's say, this Christ figure, this bull that comes to woo her, is that she wants him dead. In other words, she's out to get rid of him. And what's interesting as well, the bull is described precisely with the same detail as the Greenleaf twins are described, the same absolute description. The two are one of the same. The bull is also a scrub bull, and it wasn't the kind of bull that was expected. And once again, if you look back at the studies of the New Testament, Christ was not the one they were expecting. They were expecting a warrior Messiah, one that was going to do in their enemies and raise them to become the powerful sort of a nation in the world, and who couldn't but accept Christ, the humble God. So she's using biblical images, she's using mythological images in order to tell her story. And but again, as you go through the stories themselves, the Greenleaf story itself, there's several other sort of images that we find. In contrast to the Greenleafs, who seem to be growing, who seem to be prospering, they're alive, in contrast to the May family. In some ways, Mrs. May's two sons, Schofield and Wesley, isn't it interesting how she uses these prominent names for her two sons? They're both Schofield and Wesley represent in some ways the political and the religious strengths of both these historical characters. And yet at the same time, Schofield represents a kind of decadent materialism, and Wesley a sterile intellectualism. So again, and compared to O.T. and E.T. We also note that Mrs. May goes to church, but she doesn't believe any of it. She's in contrast to Mrs. Greenleaf. And Mrs. Greenleaf, interestingly enough, as we listen to Mrs. May describing her, she really appears a rather grotesque person. This large woman who is lying in the dirt, in the mud, in one of the back fields, and she has clipped all of the mishaps, the tragedies, the sufferings of people from the newspapers, from magazines, from things she had read, and she has them all underneath her, and she's lying on top of them, praying. And one say, well, this is kind of bizarre, who goes out into a backfield or the mud, praying to Jesus to heal all these people who are suffering. But in some ways, it's really it's precisely the way we're to pray. as we read as the Christian, or as we read in the Scripture. Jesus says, "Go to your back room or go to a place of quiet, and that nobody knows, and you pray to God." And in some ways, that's what she's doing. So as we listen to Mrs. May describing her, she appears grotesque. At the same time, if we realize what she's doing, she is the ideal prayer. She's the person who prays as one should. What's ironic is that if you remember reading toward the very last sort of section of the book, of the story, Mrs. May is imagining that somehow Mr. Greenleaf, when he went over the hill trying to locate the bull, she's imagining the bull goring him. And then the family will sue her and she'll lose everything. What's so ironic about that is that's precisely what happens to her. We hear early on in the story that the bull was antagonistic toward the car or the truck, and had ran into it several times. And as we see at the end of the story, she's there sitting on the edge of the front of the hood of the truck, waiting for Mr. Greenleaf to come around with the bull so she could have the bull shot. And if he didn't do it, she was going to kill the bull. And so what happens here is the bull comes running down the hillside of the pasture, and then he gores her here. And the last of the story is that she's leaning over the head of the bull, whispering in some last discovery that she made. And that's always kind of an intriguing sort of conclusion. And we wonder, what was it that she was whispering into the ear of the bull? I'm going to just read that for you just for a moment. Mr. Greenleaf is coming out of the woods too, but he was not. "Here he is, Mr. Greenleaf," she called. In other words, she recognized the bull coming, so she yells out to Mr. Greenleaf. She called and looked on the other side of the pasture to see if he could be coming out there, but he was not in sight. She looked back and saw that the bull, his head lowered, was racing toward her. She remained perfectly still, not in fright, but in a freezing unbelief. She stared at the violent black streak bounding toward her, as if she had no sense of distance, as if she could not decide at once what his intention was. And the bull had buried his head in her lap, like a wild, tormented lover, before her expression changed. One of his horns sank until it pierced her heart, and the other curved around her side and held her in an unbreakable grip. She continued to stare straight ahead, but the entire scene in front of her had changed. The tree line was a dark wound in a world that was nothing but sky, and she had the look of a person whose sight had been suddenly restored, but who finds the light unbearable. And then it come to the end of it. He shot the bull 4 times through the eye. She did not hear the shots, but she felt the quake in the huge body as it sank, pulling her forward on its head, so that she seemed, when Mr. Greenleaf reached her, to be bent over, whispering some last discovery into the animal's ear. Again, that's a rather intriguing sort of conclusion. And oftentimes, readers like ourselves would ask, well, what was it that what did she discover at the end there? And what was she whispering into the ear of the bull that last moment before her death? And so, from the beginning until the end of the story, the bull plays a really important role, and it seems pretty clear that the bull is a mystical figure, and in so many ways, if you look at it closely, it's very much a Christ figure. And the same thing with the sun. The sun is, in some ways, again, looking back at mythology, the sun is the enabler of life. It's a source of new life and rebirth. and it's a symbol of fertility. And all through the story, she's always seems to be confronting the sun, or she's shutting herself off from the blindness of the sun, or she's startled when especially as she goes into the milking parlor by the brightness of the sun. So you have this wonderful story about a woman who perhaps is in search of meaning of somehow, and O'Connor uses these images of the bull and the sun and so many names and titles to raise the story up and above what might appear to be simply an account of a woman who gets gored by a bull and dies, and there's not much more to it. So I guess what I'm asking you to do as you read her stories, try to look for these images and these the titles and these names, and it does. And of course, it also raises other issues, in addition to the fact this may be a story about a woman who's searching, whose faith is lost, and she's searching for meaning in life. She's obviously very bitter, and she's angry. She seems to be a person without faith or hope. She's disappointed in her two miserable sons, who are so mean-spirited to her. And if you remember the one scene when she was angry, she was holding up she was at the dinner table with or the breakfast table with her two sons, and Schofield or Wesley, one of the two sons, holds up her arm, and the arm and her fist is like a dead lily, and then he refers to it, look at Mama's fist of iron. So she's struggling in life, and she's really to be pitied. And so one wonders at the end of the story, has she finally come to realize her racist attitudes, her prejudice, her ill treatment of Mr. Greenleaf, her description of the Greenleafs, her self-pity, all of those things come to life as we read it on this anagogical level. The second story that I had asked you to read for today's class was Everything That Rises Must Converge. And you might have remembered I mentioned the name Teilhard de Chardin. He was a Catholic mystic and a philosopher whose work she admired greatly. And the title of this particular short story actually comes from part of his philosophy. And what he was saying is that the more that we rise in kindness, in good manners, and honesty and truthfulness, the more we will rise until eventually we will converge with the divine. So there's that's the bottom line. And to some extent, I would love to know why she selected this title for this short story, and how it plays out in the story itself. Well, we have a number of characters here. Before I forget, one thing that's kind of important to remember when you're reading O'Connor, so oftentimes the very opening paragraph, and it said, sets the scene. It gives you all of the details in the what we call the prologue. It gives you all the details that you need to know in order to carry through to the rest of the story. So that's something that's usually, oftentimes the first one or two paragraphs kind of gives you everything you need that's necessary to interpret the story. So in this particular story, we have a number of characters. We have Julian's mother, we don't know what the mother's name is, at least I can't remember the name, I don't think it's mentioned. But there's Julian, the young college graduate who just recently, a year or two ago, just graduated from college. He's living back home with his mother. The story starts out where the mother is going to her Wednesday night reducing class, an exercise class for elderly women. And the mother, and it's free, and so the mother wants to do this every Wednesday night, but she won't travel on the bus on her own. So she's insisting that her son, presumably her 22, 23-year-old son, Julian, will take her to the exercise classes. And so the way to get there is to take the local bus. It's probably a half-hour bus ride, and then there's about a 5-block walk to the place where the exercise, probably a school, some place where they takes place. And then Julian has to sit around waiting for the mother to finish after an hour, and then they get back on the bus and they go home again. You'll also notice that they are living in a small apartment, and the apartment at one time was a very well-to-do aristocratic neighborhood with these large houses. And since that time, the neighborhood went down the drain, and these big houses were divided up into small apartments. And Julian and his mother are living in the apartment. We also discover at the beginning that Julian's mother comes from a very grand aristocratic family, the Chesneys. Her grandfather was the governor of the state of Georgia. Also, her great-grandfather was a very prominent citizen. On her mother's side, they were very important sort of aristocratic people. And so she comes and she remembers as a young woman, as a child, and growing up living on a plantation with a large, beautiful, magnificent mansion, the plantation house, with its grand staircases and the beautiful furnishings and the oriental carpets and the African American, probably at that time slaves they had, or people that were employed for the African Americans. And so hard times have fallen on the South, and so they're no longer living that. But Julian, the son, remembers as a young boy going to his grandparents' mansions, the plantation. He remembers the life, and it very much has forgotten it. So as the story opens, Julian is very unhappy about the fact that he has to take his mother, and he's very impatient with her. And she had just recently, the day before, purchased a new hat, a kind of a green purple hat that she got at the millinery shop, and she paid $7.50 for it, and that was too much money. And she could have actually paid the gas bill with that money, and she's thinking about taking the hat back. So there's this argument between Julian and the mother, and he said, "Put the hat on, let's go, let's not haggle about this any longer." So they finally get to the bus, they get on, and then the mother is saying, "I probably should take this hat back, there's too much money." What we discover about the mother is that she comes from a period in history where there is something, as she saw it, something perfectly normal about having slaves, about having sort of African American people working on the grandparents' plantation. She was very fond of them, and yet she always believed that everybody has their place. And so she keeps commenting on people she runs into about things are a mess. You know, the bottom pole has now been placed on the top, and the fact that they're riding on the bus, which has been integrated. At one time, the African Americans were not allowed to ride the bus except for the very back of the bus. And so now it's everything is sort of open. And she's sort of gives you the impression that there is some racism, obviously, with the mother. And yet Julian, on the other hand, is protesting that and claiming that his mother is essentially, he's saying in so many words, the mother is a racist, and that she's and she needs to be taught a lesson. And so funny, when they get on the bus, it's really important to listen carefully to Julian as he's commenting about the other people on the bus, and you get the impression that he is finally kind of somebody who's finally realized the horror of racism and the negativity that has been so prominent in the South for so many centuries. And so he appears as this liberated person. And yet what's interesting about Julian is that everything that goes on in that bus ride from the time they get on until the time they get off tells us something about him. First of all, it tells us that when he saw this African American, very distinguished African American coming on the bus, he moves up next to them so he could have a conversation with the new person on the bus. And he does that to annoy the mother, because he knows it's going to sort of annoy her. She believes that good manners demand that people stay on their own side of the fence, and there's none of this mixing business. And he does that deliberately. And then the second thing we notice is that this very large woman, African American woman, comes onto the bus as well. And she has this little 4-year-old boy by the name of Carver. And immediately Carver hops up next to Julian's mother. And this child, this innocent child, found something good and honest about Julian's mother, unlike Julian himself, who is giving us the impression that he's this liberated, sort of knowledgeable person who detests the racism, what have you. And at the same time, we also, as we listen to Julian thinking, as it were, he's sort of hankering for the days when they had the plantation, when they had the slaves, and they had this abundance in the midst of great poverty. So he's hankering for that, and at the same time he's proclaiming he's this liberated, sort of open-minded individual, and he sees his mother. But the mother, in some ways, is really the honest one. She's the one, even though she is raised in that environment where people stayed on their own side of the fence, and she's doing that not out of meanness or not out of the fact that she thinks the African Americans are somehow bad or evil. That's the way she was raised. There's something honest about Julian's mother. On the other hand, Julian is very much a racist and an antagonist, and his hankering for the old days when the family had the plantation, that's what he's angry about, that they lost that. And you don't recognize that right away until you listen to him more carefully. And then, of course, one of the highlights on the bus ride was that when this very large African-American woman gets on the bus, she has precisely the same hat that the mother had. And Julian was delighted to see that, because this is going to teach my mother a lesson about being prejudiced. And of course, the mother looked at it, and she was startled for a moment. She realized that they both had the same hat, but then got on with it, where Julian was angry because he was hoping the mother would have had a very bad reaction and just became so annoyed, but she doesn't. And again, one of the things that as they come to the end of the bus ride, they're about to get off, the large black African-American woman, she grabs the little boy by the hand. They're going out. And then the first thing that the mother does, Julian's mother, is that she's looking for a penny, a new shiny penny to give to the little boy. And Julian went into almost a rage because he says, "You're not going to patronize these people by giving them your pennies." And that was not the mother's intent. The mother did that out of her fondness for the little boy and the little boy's reaction to her. She did that not because she was patronizing or that she was seeing herself better than the African American, but that was good manners. And that's what the mother maintains throughout the entire story, is good manners. But at the same time, there's always that element of prejudice and racism that creeps into that. So at the end of the story, when they get off the bus, the large African-American mother is dragging her little boy down the street. The woman with the hat, the same hat that Julian's mother had on, and Julian's mother goes after her, says, "I have a penny for you." And of course, the mother of the little boy swings around with her large red pocketbook and whacks Julian's mother over the head, and she drops to the sidewalk. And which it appears, it doesn't say that, but it appears that the mother then had a stroke and she dies. And suddenly Julian realizes his own prejudice, his own narrow-mindedness, his gullibility, and he's trying to get the mother to stand up, and he suddenly realizes, as she finally dies, that he comes to a kind of a knowledge of himself. And the very last scene we have in that story is that Julian is running toward the light. As the darkness sort of recedes behind him, the darkness and the light of forgiveness and the light of redemption that he runs toward. So in some ways, this is a very typical Flannery O'Connor story, in saying that God in some ways is like the hound of heaven, constantly sort of chasing us down to stop us, that we may pause and to receive this grace, this illuminating grace that enables us to be decent human beings, that enables us to be able to see the good in other human beings. This illuminating grace that opens our hearts and our spirits to recognize the holiness and the sacredness of another human being. And so in all of her stories, there is this, like the smack of the woman's pocketbook against Julian's mother's head was what, and in some ways, what brought to light Julian's own narrow-mindedness and his own sort of spitefulness and mean-spiritedness, where the mother, even though as we listen to the story through Julian, the mother appears as a sort of racist older woman, when in fact she's not. And it's Julian's one that's the racist. So anyway, it's an interesting story, and again that notion of the more you express your kindness, and the more you grow in tolerance and understanding of others, we rise to a point where we eventually converge with the holy, with the divine. I think that's the point of that particular story. So anyway, I hope that made some sense to you, and sometimes it takes 2 or 3 readings of the stories to begin to see this these images and these, the theology or the morality of the story itself. It raises, and again, you could give an account of this story that we just reviewed with one another as a newspaper account. It could be something like this. It would be a elderly woman found dead on the sidewalk. Their son claims that an African-American woman smacked her with a pocketbook, and the police are now searching for this woman with a small child. You could that's really what it comes down to. And yet, as we read and listen to the story, you can see there's so much more to it than a simple newspaper account or a report that we might find in a news account of this, what happened. Okay? So anyway, please read carefully for Monday's class the two stories that I asked you to read. That is Good Country People, and then the very last story that we'll read together is Revelation. But again, when you read these two stories, look for the images, look at the titles, look at the names, read it carefully, and if you could somehow find yourself in the middle of the story, place yourself there in the story, place yourself in the kitchen with Joy Helga and her mother and listen to what's being said. Place yourself in the doctor's office with the carriages there and what's being said and what's being discussed by Ruby Turpin and her husband and the Wesleyan College student that's there as well. Okay? So anyway, have a good weekend, and again, thanks so much for your responses, and I'll read those carefully, and I'll get back to you I'll try to read as many of them as I can and get back to you. So have a good weekend, keep safe, and stay healthy, and with the blessings of God, may we all survive this, and there maybe hopefully will be no more sickness or deaths with the virus. Thank you. Bye-bye.